Welcome to the Contemporary Art Lectures for this term, which will be held in this lecture room every Wednesday throughout term at 4:45. And just before we start, can I remind everybody to turn off their phones, please, including myself. We've got a very exciting programme this year, and I've coordinated the programme, but I've also taken contributions from all the staff on all the courses at the Slade. So we have a very mixed programme, hopefully covering many interests. So we have a mixture this term of artists, philosophers, curators, critics, and artists working with many different media, including painting, film, sound, and sculpture. So it's a very varied programme which has taken suggestions from across the school. Today I'd very much like to welcome David Batchelor, who is an artist and a writer, and his work has a focus on colour and on the city. He's an author of several kind of key books on colour and colour theory, including Colour for the Whitechapel Gallery and also Chromophobia. It's a major survey of his work at the moment in Rio, and he also has recently taken part in a show called Colour Chart at MoMA in New York. So, thank you very much.
Can you hear me now? Yep. Thank you, Mel, for the introduction very much. Thank you, Lisa, for setting up the invitation in the first place. I know we get kicked out at 6, so I'm going to talk for less than an hour, I hope. And I'm going to talk about, it's kind of going to be in two sections. A fairly general talk about the work I've been making in the last 15 or so years, and some of the ideas about colour I've been working with, and some of the research I've done on that subject. But I want to then, for the sort of second half of the talk, to talk about a photographic project I've been working on for about 15 years, but it's just been published as a book, so I'm a bit sort of loved up with that project at the moment, so I'm going to burden you with that as well. So, and there'll be time for questions afterwards, and even if in the middle if you want to. So. This is it's not a work by me, it's a roadworks in Brazil. In Brazil and many other places, they don't have sort of designated, kite-marked, health and safety type lighting systems to sort out roadworks. They just get, in this case, a red plastic bucket and stick a light up it and stick it on the side of the road. I think in itself it's a rather beautiful thing. And this is it in the daytime, and that's it at night, as it were, though it glows rather red. This is my first digital camera, which I took this about 13, 14 years ago. And the reason I show this is because it's moments like this in the city, at least for me, that are the kind of starting point of the work. Things you see out the corner of your eye sometimes, fragments of events in the city that don't have any particular value or significance beyond being merely functional objects of one kind or another. But for me, it's those moments and those occasions that just get you thinking and get you looking and get you imagining what you might be able to do with this. Bearing in mind that I'm already, for some years, been looking at anyway, how colour occurs in the city, I guess, is my one way of describing what I've been working on since about the mid-1990s. And colour isn't evenly distributed in the city. It's not sort of equally everywhere. You tend to find vivid colour in the city in quite specific places. You don't find it in South Kensington. For example, I say that South Ken because I teach a little bit at the Royal College, and I almost never find anything interesting there to take back to the studio with me. You find much better colour in Hackney or Bethnal Green, or that's to say, you tend to find the more vivid and interesting colour in the city, at least as far as I'm concerned, in the less expensive bits. Now, why that is and what that might mean, I may or may not try to discuss as we go on. one of the great places for colour in the city is pound shops. You don't get pound shops in South Kent. I guess that's one way of sort of setting up the opposition. But it could be technically anywhere. Anyway, this was a way, if you like, a colour event in the city. It happened to be in Sao Paulo. I think I can't remember when it was. And what I tend to do is, I've got my camera, photograph it, if not just, in a way, commit it to memory and take that idea or that image to the studio and, in a way, see what comes, if anything, comes out of it. I mean, that's generally my way of working, I guess. So I saw this. I'd been thinking about plastics, good forms of colour. I'd been looking around the city. I got my photograph, and it led eventually and slightly indirectly to a series of works which I've been making since, I can't remember when, about 2000 or so, which is simply sticking lights up coloured bottles of one kind or another. This is a series of works I made simply kind of kebabbing ordinary plastic bottles over fluorescent lights. One of the great repositories of colour in the city is on certain supermarket shelves, particularly the supermarket shelves dedicated to cleaning fluids and hair products and fizzy drinks. I don't really know why that's the case, but you get some, and if you just, they're extraordinarily richly saturated materials. And, plastic bottles are absolutely ubiquitous. They're everywhere. But they're so ubiquitous, I don't think people often pay much attention to them. They're kind of overlooked. And I guess I'm interested in looking at the things that tend to get overlooked in the everyday life of, in the modern world. I mean, that's not a new idea. That's an idea that Baudelaire talked about in the 1860s. The idea that the modern artist should pay close attention to and record and depict the absolutely everyday, inconsequential events of modern life in the city. For Baudelaire, it was patent leather shoes and frocks. For me, plastic bottles and such like. This is a series of work I began out of that sort of looking at how roadworks were done in Brazil. I called them idiot sticks, this series. And I think that was because the idea of the staff or the stave always kind of connotes wisdom. And it makes me think of Joseph Beuys and Gandalf and that sort of stuff. I just wanted to sort of take it into a rather different direction. So this was one series of works I began to make with these illuminating plastic bottles. This was another one of the sort of related series, a sort of chandelier, in this case of, I think, 24 plastic watering cans. Again, each with an individual light within them. And that in turn led to much larger works in this series. I think about 300 plastic bottles on a festoon of a cable with separate lights on them, wrapped around a pillar on the side of the festival hall. And in this case, again, another very large chandelier of 500 bottles, each with a lamp inside them, each hanging in this kind of torpedo affair. In this case, in the Palm House at the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. It wasn't made for that environment. And it's a slightly odd environment for me to show in. The work was actually made originally for the Bloomberg space in London. But Bloomberg sponsor the Edinburgh Festival. And there was an opportunity, they offered to sort of pay for the work to go there. And this space was nominated. And it seemed like an interestingly odd environment to show this very artificial kind of work. So that's just one group of works I've been making. This was about 5 years ago now, I guess. I didn't start by using colour, and this is some examples of work from about 1990. In fact, for quite a while, I was fairly horrified by the idea of using colour. It seemed to me to be something which was very complicated, rather difficult, very attached to ideas of emotion, to ideas of appetite, to certain ideas of art as being all the things I didn't want it to be at the time, I think. So I was making a whole series of works which were based on sort of excluding colour fairly emphatically. In this case, these works are simply frames, sort of picture frames, which are cut or notched or doubled or multiplied to produce some kind of vaguely abstract compositions. I won't dwell on them. It's early work, which should only ever be a footnote. However, it was quite. The reason I introduced these is to indicate that, in a way, for me, the most important point was that the colour came into the work entirely by accident. It was never something I planned to do. And in my experience, the best things that happen in the studio happen by accident. They're not the things you plan and cook up over the months. They're the things that occur, not exactly spontaneously, but they occur while you're trying to figure out something else. They're the things that take you in directions that you're not familiar with. In that sense, they're things that make you learn. So I was doing these frame-like things and not getting on very well with them, and certainly not exhibiting them at the time. The idea of framing was interesting to me at the time, and it was a sort of anyone who's brought up in the realm of conceptual art and taught by conceptual artists as I was, the idea of framing is always a kind of significant subject in that. In that it's said that it's not what's intrinsic to the work that determines its value, but it's how it's framed which determines the value of art. It's how it's framed institutionally, discursively, and such like. So I thought, okay, well, I'll just make frames then, if that's the point. It didn't go very well, but I did get invited to be in a group show, and I thought what I'd do is, rather than just make frames, I had this thought which it kind of stuck with me, which is, rather than just make a few frames and hang them on the wall, I'll make a work which is dependent on how you as the viewer frame it. And so, I can, rather than try to describe it, I'll show it to you. And it was meant to be three freestanding sort of frame-like things. This was in the old Victoria Miro gallery that about 4 people in the audience will remember when it was on Cork Street. Tiny gallery, long before it moved to off Old Street. It was a summer group show, and it was sort of testing the water with a few unknown people at the time. Anyway, I was going to do these 3 freestanding frame-like things. The problem for the gallery was that they would prevent anyone else's work being seen from outside the gallery, which of course was the entire point. So they took one out, and I was going to call it the 3 Graces to give it a kind of classical illusion. And then they wouldn't allow all 3 in, so we kind of had an argument on the doorstep. And then it became the 2 Graces, and it was kind of went downhill from there, and it wasn't a very happy experience, and I never showed with this gallery again. And it was one of those things. But the thing about this gallery was that it had a window opening directly onto the street, and the entrance to the gallery was up the side. So you kind of went into the gallery at the back of it. So the great idea with this was you had these sort of frame-like things visible from the street, but when you went in from the gallery, into the gallery, and you saw them, you'd hopefully feel kind of cheated. They were just like theatrical props. And I have to say that although these works were not successful in their own terms, or certainly in any other terms, there's something about them that stuck with me, which was this relationship between front and back. These are the first ever freestanding works I'd made, but I didn't want to make sculpture that was in the round, sculpture that so that whatever angle you approached it from, it would somehow be the same kind of experience. I was interested in making 3-dimensional work which was radically different depending on where you approached it from, front and back. And I think I only kind of reasoned this out rather later on, but I think the thought behind it was that that's more like how things are in the city. You don't get things in the round. That's nature, trees or mountains or whatever. The city is an experience of surfaces and flats rather than solids, anyway, buildings, etc. The billboard is the sort of perfect example of the sort of city architecture. It's all sort of flashy and attractive from one side, and it's just steel and from the other side. Anyway, that was the sort of vague idea behind it. The work, of course, went back to the studio afterwards. It was all a bit dismal. But the idea sort of stuck with me, and it was one of those curious things. I'm sure everyone's experienced this. I spent about 3 months making these things. I wasn't happy with it, nor was anyone else. Came back to the studio and made a work in about half a day that seemed to have more going for it than the thing I spent 3 months working. It was only that big, and this is it. And the reason I show it is it's the first work I ever made using any color. And it's a piece of plexiglass, piece of perspex, painted on the back with pink paint, which I happen to have in the studio. And that's the front of it, and this was the back of it. And that was it. So it's the same sort of theme, front and back, and trying to sort of dramatize the difference between the front and the back. And the reason for painting it pink was simply to advertise that difference more. Not because I was interested in color, but the minute I did it, it's my little homage to Cubism as well. The minute I did it, I knew that it was more interesting than these lumbering things I'd made months before. B, it kind of was aware that, it made me aware, I guess, gradually, that there wasn't much colour in contemporary art at the time. At the time, it's not, things change. And I wondered why that was. And it made me think, well, maybe there's some room to make some work here, vaguely. So I began to think about colour. Also, painting on the back of plexiglass gives the colour a very, very sort of industrial, shiny, flat finish. It's not like painting. It's more like something that's come off out of a production line. And it makes it look very artificial. So that device seemed something I could work with. And I just spent kind of quite a long time from then figuring out how I could make these very vividly coloured three-dimensional works, which had a sort of radical difference between the face and the support. I was also interested in the monochrome as a kind of painting. I remain very interested in the monochrome as a subject. The monochrome is the dumbest kind of painting that anyone could make. But that also, in some respects, I think makes it the most interesting kind of painting because it's so potentially dumb. As I've said before, anyone can make a monochrome. Anyone who's painted a door has made a monochrome. The question is, how can you make one that's not like every other monochrome? How can you make one that's not like Robert Rauschenberg or Yves Klein or Lucio Fontana or Gerhard Richter or Ellsworth Kelly and so on? And that, I think, again, sort of that stuck with me. And that's what I guess I began to concentrate on, these two things, colour and the monochrome. And I think the monochrome in relationship to the ready-made, I guess. And the first three-dimensional monochromes I exhibited were these monochromes on wheels. And this was in the Economist building in 1996. That's right. When they used to do, I think maybe they still do contemporary shows in the kind of foyer area of this sort of modernist office block. These works came about, again, by virtue of a studio accident. I was making a big panel of red plexiglass, which I'd painted on the back. It takes a long time to dry. I needed to put the plexiglass somewhere to dry out. I had this old dolly in the studio for moving around my three graces, and I put the plexiglass on the dolly, and it kind of fitted. It simply sort of sat on it quite efficiently. And it was that made me think, well, maybe that's the way of supporting these monochrome panels. It's kind of absurd, but at the same time, it's a way of displaying them. And I was also interested in the idea of a kind of producing works of vivid colours, but having the relationship between the colours being very provisional rather than fixed. So not like a composition of four colours, but somehow to make a work or a series of works of a number of colours which could anyway be reorganised and reconfigured. And by sticking something on wheels, it immediately implies that it's not fixed. I mean, it's literally not fixed, but it implies that everything could be rearranged, and I liked that sense of the informality of that, I guess. It also was a way of working that, and again, that's something that every single person here will have experienced, is that anxiety about when a work is finished. If I do a bit more to it, will it make it better or will it ruin it? This provided me with a way of working which I've kind of continued with ever since, which is by a way of working which is making work by making a series of modules, if you like. Finding, in this case, 20 different dollies, and building them in the studio, doing the colors on them, and then only configuring them when they get to the gallery. So the gallery, in a way, determines the shape they go in, how many there are. If there are too many, just takes them away. And then when the show's over, the work comes back to the studio, and next time it goes out, it just goes out in a different form. It sort of avoids that problem of, is it finished? Because it can be kind of endlessly continued. It generates other problems, particularly when a gallery 2 years later says, that one you showed back then, is it still around? You go, yeah, there's one bit's over there, and that sort of thing. These were the first color-based works I exhibited. About 3 or 4 years after I began working on color as a subject. At the same time as doing that, I was reading around color. I was wondering why there seems to be at the time so little color-based work in contemporary art. I'd also had this experience of going to a collector's house in North London. And the house was a Victorian house which had been redesigned or converted by a so-called minimalist architect. And what the architect had done was to strip out every single element of Victorian decorative detail, completely sort of gut the house, but also then to entirely make the house white inside. So all the floors, all the walls, all the ceilings are white. Put frosted glass on the windows to keep the color out, as it were, of nature. And all the furniture in the house was black. And every single work of art in the house was grey. And this is absolutely true. And I won't, believe me. It was a really creepy experience. I mean, it was very impressive. It was a very big house, and there were very expensive works. Some of them there was a Richter grey painting. I mean, don't knock it. But it was kind of weird when you stick all this stuff together. And it made me wonder, what's this about? Why? What does this signify? Such a sort of emphatic exclusion of colour from this immensely sort of culturally sophisticated environment. And that got me reading around, and it got me looking, and eventually, and then I was invited to a show, and I was invited then to write a short pamphlet. It was in the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds on colour and sculpture or something. And I began to try to describe this apparent sort of fear of colour that I noticed in this environment and in quite a range of contemporary art at the time, and that seemed to come through some of the philosophical reading I've been doing and some of the art history that I'd been reading around and so on. And I had to find a title for this essay, and I said, well, there's this. I remember writing and saying, there's this sort of fear of colour. It's almost like a phobia, a chromophobia. And I thought, well, that's at least I've got a good title, and that's what. And then that led me. It was a little 1,000-word essay, and then I'd written it. I thought, well, there's probably more here to sort of excavate and find out. Anyway, that gradually led to my researching and then writing the book, which was published in 2000, called Chromophobia. And what I picked up very, very quickly when I was reading around colour, and it sounds a bit grand, but you can detect this in Aristotle, and you can detect it in the work of Le Corbusier. This strategic resistance to colour in the West. Everything I say is, in ways, going to be prefaced by saying in the West. That in the West there's a philosophical skepticism of colour, or a loathing of colour at some place. It's as if colour points in the wrong directions. And colour is often identified in these writings as somehow alien to the Western mind. And it's usually, in one of two ways, it's usually either seen as being other than masculine and other than philosophical. it's seen as being feminine or oriental or primitive or kitsch or infantile. So it's somehow not grown up. It's not literary. It's not philosophical. It's somehow all these other things. I mean, assuming a sort of fairly dubious sexual politics that goes with that. And that was kind of just seemed quite bizarre. And it was bizarre how regularly this cropped up in these considerations of colour, that it was somehow other to the higher workings of the Western mind. The other way in which colour was sort of marginalised in these writings was it being described as being superficial, also cosmetic, which also genders colour, obviously, enough, more or less. So colour was either seen as somehow, as feminine, oriental, primitive, infantile, kitsch, etc., or it was seen as merely cosmetic. And the idea about colour being cosmetic is it suggests that it could be wiped off, that reality is somehow there in spite of colour, and that in order to understand the world how it is, you need, in some ways, to exclude colour, because the argument goes, cosmetics are a deception. They can beautify, but they can also deceive and seduce. So there's a kind of sexuality of colour. Colour is seen as being belonging to the appetites rather than the mind, belonging to the body rather than the mind. So I mean, this struck me as, rivetingly interesting. This strategic marginalisation of colour in the West. And I have one quick quotation to read to kind of ram that point home rather unsubtly. So this is a short passage from a French colour theorist writing in 1850 or so. The guy's name is Charles Blanc, or Charles White. But I take it that that's just accidental. So he goes, and he's writing about, it's a book called The Grammar of Painting and Engraving. And then in a traditional academic training, there's an opposition, there's always an assumed opposition between drawing and colouring in, or disegno and colore in the Italian, and so design and colour. So this is Charles Blanc. He says, the union of design and colour is necessary to beget painting, just as is the union of man and woman to beget mankind. You know where it's going. But design must maintain its preponderance over colour. Otherwise, painting speeds to its ruin. It will fall through colour, just as mankind fell through Eve. You couldn't. I suppose the women laughing there. The guys thinking, oh shit. You couldn't make it up, and I didn't make it up. But it's a perfect example of chromophobia, if you will. And it's quite telling how it's phrased as well. So the gendering of colour. Colour is feminine. Drawing, line is masculine. That's quite typical of academic theory. Interestingly, it's actually, in some respects, no, it's not subtler. That's wrong. It recognises you can't get rid of colour, in the same way that you can't get rid of half the species, women. So it's part of painting. It has to be part of painting. But if you can't get rid of it, you just got to subordinate it. So you've got to control it, harness it. And moreover, it's phrased in Old Testament terms. Adam and Eve. I mean, don't get more Old Testament than that. And quite specifically, the imagery is the imagery of the fall. That you fall, colour brings on the fall, a fall from grace. There's a sort of hierarchy. You're up there in the world of the spirits, and colour will undermine all that hard, elegant work of the mind and philosophy and stuff, and it'll be a fall into the body, into appetites, into and desire. Interestingly, that image of the fall through colour is also very, very common, and you find it in a wide range of writings on colour. I mean, if that text by Charles Blanc was a chromophobic text, there are other writers are chromophilic, who've written very positively about colour. One of them is Roland Barthes. I mean, Roland Barthes is a strange writer because he wrote, well, when he wrote about photography, he was against colour. And when he wrote about painting, he was for colour. And Roland Barthes said about in photography, in Camera Lucida, he said, colour in photography always looks false. It doesn't feel real. It always feels like a cosmetic. He says a cosmetic of the kind they use to paint corpses. It's a weird, strange description of colour in the photograph. He preferred black and white photographs. But again, he uses this image of the cosmetic and of corpses, of death. And of course, every photograph is a form of death. When he was writing about painting, and he only wrote about painting a couple of times. One was about the work of Andy Warhol, and one was about the work of Cy Twombly. And he wrote about them both because of his interest in colour. Warhol's work he described as chemical, the colours being chemical, which I think is a great description. When he was writing about Twombly, he said, colour is a kind of bliss, which is nice. Anyone said it's like a closing of an eyelid or a tiny fainting spell. Now, I don't actually know what that means, except for I kind of find it strange and compelling. But the idea of describing colour as a kind of fainting spell is also to describe it as a kind of fall, a falling out of consciousness in that case, a sort of a moment of lapse where the rational mind is not functioning, if you like. But this was, for Barthes, that was an entirely positive thing. That was the great thing about colour, is that it could have that effect on someone. But again, he uses that same imagery, one of a fall, to some extent at least, as Charles Blanc used. And there are other versions of the fall and colour. And the best one of which, the best essay on colour, and there's some great writers on colour in the 20th century and the 19th century, Wittgenstein, Roland Barthes, Umberto Eco, Julia Kristeva, many, many others, Walter Benjamin, and there's a lot of very, very good stuff where colour's danger is seen as a positive value. Colour's threat to rationality is seen as exactly the reason for attending to it. But the best essay on colour this century isn't a philosophical text. It's a film, and the film is The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz is the greatest essay on colour that has ever been written. And I'm assuming that most of you know it, because I'm going to ruin it for you if you haven't seen the film. In The Wizard of Oz, everything is grey. This was a film made in 1938, I think, when colour film stock hardly existed. And mainstream films were only just about to go into colour. So it was one of the first ever Technicolor films. So it's impossible to imagine now what it must have been like to go and see this film, particularly because you go along and you start with a black and white film. And there's Dorothy and her dog in Kansas, and Kansas is grey. I mean, really grey. And then along comes a tornado, which makes it even greyer and darker. And then then Dorothy is in the little cottage, and the cottage gets whipped up by the tornado, and then it somehow falls, and Dorothy falls. It's another great essay about the fall, and the fall into colour, because, as you will know, she lands in Munchkinland, and Munchkinland is kind of hyperchromatic. And this is this brilliant transition from the first 15 minutes of the filming in black and white, going into colour. And she opens the door of the cottage, and there she is in Munchkinland, and they're the Munchkins. And there's the Wicked Witch of the East underneath the cottage, and there's the yellow brick road, and the ruby slippers, and the emerald city, and everything is cast in the colours of gems and jewels, and it's extraordinary. But, Dorothy has fallen into colour. It's a great... and then, of course, at the end of the film, you learn that not only has Dorothy just fallen out of the tornado and into Munchkinland, that her fall is of a different kind, and she's fallen unconscious. She's been knocked on the head. So she's, again, the episode of colour is an episode of a loss of consciousness. Again, so not unlike Barthes' fainting spell, it just goes on a little longer. But again, and And then there are a number of movies which use colour in the same way. I got a bit obsessed with movies which use black and white and colour stock. I mean, the other really great example, for my money at least, is the Wim Wenders film Wings of Desire, which also uses black and white and colour stock. And for Wim Wenders, and his film is in turn taken from a Michael Powell film, A Matter of Life and Death. But in the Wenders film, you meet, set in Berlin, there's a couple of angels who are just hanging around, as you do, in the world of the spirits, and it's in black and white. And they can hear everyone's thoughts. And they sit in a library, and there's this beautiful scene of this babble of thoughts going on in the library, and they just sit around without much to do. And then one of the angels falls in love with a trapeze artist. And he moves from the world of the spirits to the embodied world, the world of desire. And he falls. He falls out of the world of spirits, and he falls into colour. In this case, it's in what was the no man's land between East and West Berlin, because the film was made in the mid-'80s, I guess. And he falls, he hurts himself as he lands, and he falls into colour. Berlin suddenly in colour. And he stands up and he finds some blood on his forehead. And there's a passerby, and he says, the first words the angel says is, "What colour is this?" And he learns the colours. He says, and then he points to the Berlin Wall, which has all this graffiti on it, very, very colourful graffiti. And he says, "What colour's that? What colour's that?" And the first thing he does is he learns the names of the colours. Anyway, so there's all that stuff, the fall into colour. Anyway, enough of them. It struck me that if what was happening in the studio was that my subject was becoming this colour as you experience in the city, that one of the things I needed to look at was how other ways in which colour is experienced in the city, and one of the main ways it's experienced is in illuminated colour. That's so common these days, but it's illuminated colour of the kinds we see now, fluorescent lights, plexiglass. It's not much more than 50 or 60 years old. I mean, to me, that's no time at all. To you, that may seem a lot longer. But it's a very recent phenomenon, the colour as we experience it now. Huge panels of monochromatic colours. Anyway, so I began just simply to acquire old light boxes, old exit signs, restaurant signs, whatever I could from salvage yards in Hackney and around there, and then began to try to figure out what to do with them. I would take out the signs saying kebabs or whatever, and put in single panels of coloured plexiglass, and then eventually began to produce these kind of stacks, these towers of light boxes. Again, I don't claim any skill at all in terms of like sculptural composition. This is really not. It's steel shelving with boxes stuck on them. The dollies in this case I arranged in a slightly more random fashion, as if they were kind of grazing beneath the tower. And again, the way I tend to work is once I've done one version of it, I knock off a few more. And I decided that these towers should always be the same height as the building that they were being exhibited in. That's simply one way of making them stand up properly. But then, and it makes them relatively, not exactly site-specific, but at least related to the site that they're inhabiting. This was from a show in Barcelona, and this was the biggest one I did, which was over 15 meters tall, and it was in this case, it was in the 2004 Sao Paulo Biennale in Brazil, in one of the great buildings of the modern period. It's a building designed specifically for the Sao Paulo Biennale, which was initiated in 1951, the second of all biennales. I know every other village has a biennale these days, but originally there was Venice from 1890 something, I think, and the second biennale, international biennale, was Sao Paulo. Probably not where you'd have expected the second biennale to be. And I think in the early 60s they designed this building, a 3-story building, by the great Brazilian architect Oscar Niemeyer to house the biennale. So it all takes place in one building. And it's a fantastic building. I mean, concrete works in the tropics better than it works in Northern Europe, partly because you can you can keep it open to the elements much more. Niemeyer is one of the great architects of the 20th century, but there are other great architects from Brazil at the same time whose work's been slightly eclipsed because of the dominance of Niemeyer's. Nevertheless, so this, probably, if I could have selected one building in the world to, stick a large tower, it probably would have been this one. It also meant that the work was visible from wherever you were in the Biennale. And given that group shows are about a kind of war of artists against artists, what you can't see, this also has the front and back thing. The back of it is just the steel light boxes. There's no colour on the back at all. This was also the beginning of a relationship I've developed since, which is working in Brazil, both as a place to find materials, which has been great for me, but also I think it's something I've learned about really over the last 10 or 12 years, is the history of Brazilian modern contemporary art is as interesting, at least as interesting as in any other country in the world. But it's not something I ever learned about when I was a student. I only learned about American art and European art and British art. But Brazilian art of the 20th century I was second to none. And Brazilian architecture is also of the same type. And there's an important relationship between the two, which is that whereas in the States and in sort of European and American abstract art tended to get, or at least the theory of it, tended to isolate it and think its place was principally and exclusively in the museum. What happened in a lot of Latin American art, and they were as involved in ideas of abstraction in the post-war period, taking the work from the inspiration of Mondrian and Malevich and so on. What happened in Latin America more, and this is both in Brazil and also in Venezuela and in Peru to some extent, is that abstract art went out into the streets. And a great deal of the work ended up in large-scale architectural projects. And I think in a way became integrated in the life of the city in a way which it never really happened in Western Europe or in North America. And I think it offered in a way a different trajectory of radical post-war work than it became kind of socialized rather than privatized, I guess. And that strikes me as an incredibly rich and alternative to the tradition that at least I was brought up in. I'm sure you probably haven't been so much. So anyway, that's Brazil. Go there. There's a Biennale on at the moment. If you've got a few hundred, well, I don't know. If you've got if you can get the college, if there's a travel fund, go to Brazil. And if you don't like the art, there's always the beach. And there's the music, and there's the architecture. I mean, it's Rio and Sao Paulo are two of the great cities for modern contemporary art. That's my take-home point today. And one of the things that interests me about using illumination as a form of color is that whenever you put one of this stuff in a particular type of environment, you always get the peripheral effects of the color, the reflections that you can't contain or control. It's as if the color is sort of spilling out of the work and infecting the environment. And that's, for me, the great thing about color is that you can't, however hard people have tried to produce theories which contain color or geometries of color circles or color stars and triangles, however hard people have tried to contain color, it always escapes those attempts. It's so complex. It's so variable. It's so affected by such subtle differences and changes that it seems not exactly immune to being theorized, but there's always this sense that it escapes you. And I think certainly color escapes language. And we live in a profoundly linguistic world. And I think this is certainly one of the reasons that Wittgenstein became interesting. Wittgenstein was the great philosopher of language, one of the great philosophers of language of the 20th century. And his last book was on color. And because for Wittgenstein, color exposes the limits of language. It helps us apprehend those forms of experience that we cannot put into words, to see where the limits of language are. I mean, the other area that Wittgenstein thought was worthy of study was color and pain. Pain was another way in which was also immune to language, well, not immune to language, but always escaped language. Well, I won't go on about that. And one of the things that interests me so much about colour, I guess, is that colour is an experience that we all have, unless we're one of very, very, very rare people who are colourblind. And most colourblind people are men, by the way. It's genetic. It's a chromosome problem. We all experience colour all day, and if we're dreaming colour, which most people do, half the night. And yet, we don't really know what it is. Scientists don't quite know where is colour. Is colour in the object that we look at, or is it in the brain? Or is it in the relationship between the two? Again, Wittgenstein's question was, his one question was, how do I know this is red? And his answer was, because I speak English. Although he actually wrote that in German, but this is the translation. That's to say that red red doesn't describe something out there. It's a term related to other colour terms. He also said, if someone throws a rock and it hits me on the head, I'm going to feel pain, right? Obviously enough. Would it make sense to say that that rock contained the pain that I feel? Well, obviously not. But he said, if I look at a tomato on the shelf and it's red, do I say that tomato contains the redness? And you generally would be tempted to say yes. For Wittgenstein, it made no more sense to say that the tomato was red than to say the rock contains the pain. The tomato made I always lose it at a certain point with that stuff. But anyway, I got interested then with using colour which is in a way more reflected than direct. And I got it, and so I made a series of dollies which were sort of the reverse of the other ones. Whereas the other ones had a colourful top and a sort of dirty surround, these have a sort of dirty top and a sort of colourful surround. And they're based on those pimped up cars that you get in some places, where you illuminate underneath, you can't drive around and look like an idiot. But I thought I sort of pimp up a few dollies. And they're just fluorescent lights with coloured sleeves on them. And again, I got the front and back things have stuck with me. And I made a series of light boxes, such as this one, which you were meant to see from the front and the back. But actually, I decided I didn't like the front of it very much, so I stuck up against the wall. And again, and it's a series I'm still working on. I only make these things occasionally. I'm kind of interested in the idea of a work that's sort of looking away from you. It's as if it's sort of standing in the corner. And you see the back of it, and the back of it's got all the paraphernalia of the construction and the little holes in it where the white light sticks through. And it generates this kind of halo around it. And I went on to produce a series of these, I call them backlights because I couldn't think of anything else to call them. And this was one I showed in the gallery in Sao Paulo that I worked with, again, a big concrete gallery. And there's three kind of totemic, reversed out, as you were, structures, or just about 30 centimeters from the wall, so you get this kind of halo effect. This gallery is designed by another great Brazilian architect, Paulo Mendes de Rocha, who's somewhat younger than Niemeyer, but again, but they're kind of punishing environments. I mean, they're brilliant, but they're hard. Obviously, they're kind of, anyway. And this was one I made one I made for that series of commissions that London Underground did called Platform for Art. It was at Gloucester Road Tube Station. And again, there were these, in most cases, the elements are wastage from London Underground waste. So these three elements here are three London Underground roundels, sort of stick together and then with the lights. And the niches on this rather beautiful Victorian industrial architecture sort of contain the colour. They sort of did sort of 10 silhouettes using these different colours and these waste materials. So, I can't remember what goes next. Oh yeah. I've only got a few more images of this lot to show. Having done quite a lot of illuminated colour, I mean, illuminated colour is so intense, it's so vivid, it's kind of addictive. And I was in a group show once, and it was subtitled Light Art. And I hate the term light art. And it was all artists who used, illuminated forms of one kind or another. And I said, there was a talk around the show, and I announced that my next show was going to be called Unplugged. It was going to be my acoustic album, and it was going to be not illuminated. To remind myself as much as anyone else that it's not only about that illumination is one form of colour that you experience in the city. It's not the only form. And that led me eventually to make this group of works, which were a series of pillars, of simple steel pillars, which I then attached several hundred small plastic elements I got from pound shops. As I said at the beginning, pound shops are one of the great colour moments in the city. So much of the stuff there is so vividly coloured bits of plastic. Knives and forks and hairbrushes and toys and pegs and clips of one kind or another. They're kind of rubbish, but and this was basically what I do in the studio. When I get some stuff, bring it back to the studio and colour code it, which is not that clever, but it sort of helps. So these are all these various objects and then they cost next to nothing. And this was the way the works were exhibited in Wilkinson Gallery, where I've showed a couple of times down on Viner Street. And it was a relief for me to get away from illumination, although I never get far away from it. And then this is another I think the last work I want to show of this series, another unilluminated work, which was shown in the first Folkestone Triennale 2 years ago. And they're made from, it's 120 balls made from very cheap plastic sunglasses that I got in a street market in Brazil. Now in Brazil, I didn't know this, but in Brazil, when they have a party, you don't put hats on. You don't buy party hats. You buy sunglasses. Kind of makes sense. But they're not real sunglasses. They're dirt cheap plastic things which you throw away after the party. And everyone sticks them on. Everyone thinks it's hilarious, and everyone gets drunk. So I found this place which sold these intensely coloured plastic sunglasses. And basically, I just bought a load. Not that many, and again, took them to the studio to figure out what, if anything, I could do with them. And it turned out, I honestly don't remember how this happened. It turns out that if you put them together in a certain way, they form these globes. And so I thought, okay. And I made individual ones, and I just thought, I'll just have these globes. And I think this was my booty from Brazil. That's only one suitcase. You have these sort of panic attacks as you go through customs. It's not actually worth anything. It's not. There's no point in smuggling this. It's not worth anything. But okay. So what are you doing with 3,000 pairs of sunglasses? And you don't want to say I'm an artist. That sounds so pretentious. And anyway, actually, no one ever stops you. Well, they do sometimes, but not this time. So it was all right. And originally I just made them as these balls which I kind of stuck on the floor. But then the Folkestone invitation came, to participate in the Triennale, and there was this beautiful, beautiful space which was a ballroom on the back of an old, sort of now rather derelict hotel, which faces the sea, and actually not on this day, but the sun, it's glass on three sides. You get this fantastic light pouring in. It's just these floor-to-ceiling windows. And I just thought, okay, well, I know, I'll stick some balls in the ballroom. And because it was the seaside, it all sort of made some sort of spurious sense. But it was just, in a way, it was, as is often the case, I guess, that it's the site that sort of gets you thinking about what you could do with these materials and so on. So that was, all my early work is rectangular. And I always put that down to having, been starting as a painter. It's a sort of the hangover from painting. All the work I make now is circular and spherical. So I don't know, maybe I'll move on to triangles in a few years, and then I'll have my own little Bauhaus to do. This is what happens when you stick a light on some of those sunglasses. This is just an angle poised lamp up against one of these balls of sunglasses, which, and incidentally, the ones in focus, and they're all on motors, so they all rotate very slowly in different directions, very, very slowly in this ballroom. So there's a kind of dance-like thing. And so this one's like a kind of very, very cheap light show. And the motors are just for mirror ball motors from discos. And these, a series of works I've been making for some time, which are basically all the leftover flecks that I get in the studio. Color code it, wrap it up. And if you are passing Bloomberg, not Bloomberg Space where they have the exhibitions, but the Bloomberg headquarters, which is just next door to the Bloomberg Space on the corner, just in Finsbury Square, there's the main entrance to Bloomberg headquarters. And Bloomberg invited a number of artists to make work from their waste materials. It was a sort of greenwash, effect. Making them look like they really care about all the vast quantities of waste that they generate. And I said, okay, give us your flecks. And so I made a series of 7 of these balls of flecks, all in different colors, and 5 of them are in the entrance. It's a very, very flashy marble entrance, and 5 balls of flecks look kind of out of place there, which was exactly the aim. Okay. At the same time, this is the work I want to finish on. At the same time as I began making the dollies in about 1997. I began making a series of drawings, which I've carried on working around the same time. I only worked this out very recently. I also began to make this series of photographs in 1997. The dollies were 1996. And I realized that almost everything I make takes about 15 years, 10 or 12 or 15 years, before it kind of gets into its rhythm or something. I wanted to, this series, which is basically a series of photographs of blank white rectangles that I find in the city. So the works, it's similar to the other materials because so much of other work, so much of it is found on the city streets. And what got me going with these was that Jeff Wall had done a talk at the Slade, at the Slade, in the Darwin Lecture Theatre, again in 1996 or so, I think. And he was making an argument about the history of art. I mean, he does that kind of thing. And he made this very, very compelling argument about, he said there's two tendencies in modern art since Manet and Baudelaire. One is the painting of modern life, which is about recording the experiences of the city as they occur, in paintings or more recently in photography. And he said, so the painting of modern life goes in that direction, or goes in one direction. The other tradition of within modernism is the tradition of abstraction, which goes in the opposite direction. At least, or they're parallel to each other, but they cannot be reconciled. One is about an inclusive relationship with the world and recording the world and showing the world as it is. The other is about excluding the world, the tradition of abstraction, he argued. And the tradition of abstraction for Jeff Wall has its apotheosis in the monochrome, the flat, unmodulated, single-color, rectangular canvas. And Jeff Wall argued that the monochrome is the opposite of the painting of modern life. And I thought, that's a really good argument, but I don't kind of believe it. It makes sense, but didn't seem to ring true in a way. And so what I thought I'd do is, okay, I'll prove him wrong. I'll go out into the street with my camera and I'll go and find monochromes and I'll photograph them and I'll say, look, no, you do get monochromes in the city. And that was my sort of slightly facetious starting point with these, which was to show that the monochrome is in the city. And it was, and it is, and they're everywhere. But you won't notice them, or you will now. You may. but what kept me going with me? So I thought if I take 4 or 5 of them, then I'll have this kind of argument, and they were going to be I was going to do it use them in an essay about Jeff Wall's. And then, the more I took them, the more kind of interested I became in these things in their own right, in that they're kind of weird to me, because the city is a place which is so saturated visually. There's so much information around. There's so many things that are constantly calling for your attention in one form or another, that to find a kind of blank in the city, a moment of respite from that sort of saturation, is in itself quite a weird, odd thing. And so the monochromes are almost like absences, or the white ones at least. I found some coloured ones too, but actually the white ones are the ones that work best, because they seem more like holes in the visual fabric, more like voids than like things, more like absences than presences. And so, the Jeff Wall thing got me going with these, but actually very quickly that fell away. And I became much more interested almost in the sort of psychological relationship between the city and its gaps and its absences. And the thing about these monochromes is they're all unintended. They're not meant to be there in a way. And they aren't there for long. They get tagged, or they get painted over, or the sign gets put back that was meant to be there. And sometimes, weirdly, graffiti people paint around them and leave them. And the weird thing is that if you look for them, they are there. And if you don't look for them, they're not there. But again, it's that thing about, I think what these have in common with the other work is that they're about looking at the city and looking for things that are there but are sort of so pointless in a way, or so insignificant in some respects that they're not visible. They're there but not really visible, or they're overlooked. And this is my American one. This is in New Mexico. And basically what I do now is when I photograph it if I'm in London, but when I travel for whatever reason, just take my camera with me, and you've got half a day before the plane flies. If you just go for a walk in the city, the chances are I can pick up a few monochromes. And you feel you haven't wasted your time. This is one from Chile. And I started showing these as prints, a few at a time. Then I thought, if I get 80 of them, I can do them as a slideshow. It'll be a sort of continue. And I love slide projections, much more than I love PowerPoint. So I got 80 of them eventually, and I did them as a slideshow. And then I saw another one. I thought, oh, okay, so I'll take that. And now the reason I'm a bit sort of involved with these is I've just published a book of them through Riding House Press, which is the press connected with Carsten Schubert Gallery, and of the first 250. And they're called Found Monochromes, Volume 1, rather grandly, and numbers 1 to 250, because we're going to do Volume 2 later. And so they've been working on them now for 14 years, and there's no sign of them stopping yet. Oh, yeah. So that's it. I'd happily take 5 or 10 minutes of questions if you have any. But then we have to leave at 6. Immediately, one up there.
I wonder what did you actually frame when you showed your own frames? What did you actually frame? Did you frame them all on white piece of paper?
Oh yeah, yeah. I just got. I made. They're just empty frames. So there's a backing board, just a white backing board, and the framing edge and the glass, and the fillet and all that. They're kind of. They're sort of frames that just don't have anything in them. So they're. Yeah, I guess. Yeah. But you're welcome to talk about more recent work. So, there was again one. Well, there's a kind of weird. Okay, one thing I meant to mention is that one thing you get when you get to my kind of age, one thing you pick up on a lot is recurrences, things that come back at you 10 years after you thought you may have got. In a way, these monochrome panels are are some kind of recurrence of those earlier things, I guess. And the back and front thing kind of has recurred over a number of years, and those recurrences begin to sort of tell you a bit about yourself. Not necessarily things you want to know, but, you know. Sorry, there was a question at the back.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, it seems like at the beginning you started with form being the driver and color was kind of a happenstance element. And do you think that now color is your driver and form is just what works with what you're trying to do?
Yeah, I think that I was very aware that the forms I was using were pretty rudimentary, and in a way I wanted to get away from that sort of slightly heavy, you know, geometry in some cases. And I think the work has become more formless in a way. The chandeliers and the clusters of, you know, of those pound shop things. It's kind of a bit more sort of miasmic, a bit vaguer. And I'm glad that that's happened. So in that, yeah, I'd absolutely think so. Yeah, I mean, at least so far. And I was always looking for a way of the colour sort of spilling and not being contained. And the problem about the rectangle is it's a container, literally, and sort of, you know, and metaphorically, I think too. So yeah, but it took me a long time to get off the rectangle. It really did. I'm kind of relieved. If I've achieved anything, yes. So I got off the rectangle. There was.
I'm sorry, I just pointed to the rectangle.
Oh. Yeah, well, yeah. Yeah. That was a really dumb thing to say, wasn't it? Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Wasn't there someone vaguely... Oh, okay, there's one there.
I saw your chandeliers in London years ago. And what struck me that there seemed to be two sculptures. One was intended and one was unintentional, because there was so much cabling that came off the
That's right.
You had to tail it in some way, so it became another sculpture. So it almost was like your front and back.
Ah.
It was unintended.
Well, it was, I mean, what I couldn't believe that there was 10 kilometres of cable in that work. I thought, hang on a minute, how to do that? And it was necessary. I mean, one thing is whenever I do something which is illuminated, I always like to show, you know, where the power comes from. I don't do that kind of magic trick kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely. And partly because, so the cable's always an important part, and I do a little bit too much cable sometimes. You know, I kind of over-egg it a bit, and that was certainly the case in that Bloomberg thing. And when we hung it in the Palm House, there was this huge kind of thick strands of cable kind of going along this balcony, and the cable in a way is as important as the rest of it. And yes, it does have that sort of relationship of it. It's the sort of support that's sort of a very inert material in a way. And I guess that's why I made those balls of cable, was to make them the centre of the work, rather than in a way they're just, as it were, the support. But absolutely, and yeah, cable. I mean, again, cable's one of those things which is, again, it's absolutely ubiquitous. It's, we couldn't function without flex in a million ways, and yet, it's kind of hidden and it's avoided and it's seen as a sort of a mess of stuff. But I think it's fine stuff.
Yeah, you said that your interest was how color is found in the city. Did you ever think about color in clothing and when people dress themselves?
Yeah. I mean, no. I get asked to talk at sort of conferences about colour and design, and I haven't got a clue about it. I'm interested that everyone wears black in the art world. That's not bad today, not bad. So yeah, I mean, I am interested in it.
People like in poor neighborhoods, like you were saying, just how that demographic.
Yeah, I mean, again, even expensive cars tend to be, black, Mercs, Beamers and such like, and it's the Renault Twingo, which is pink, or the Nissan Micra. And it's sort of there's a kind of weird relationship with some of those things. It doesn't. You can't make a formula of it in the end, because it changes a lot, and in different cultures, colour signifies in very different ways, obviously. And I haven't done that kind of anthropology at all, and I leave that to anthropologists, I guess. But it is a subject that it cannot be contained by one sort of special. I'm coming to you. I definitely come to you. And one of the things that's so interesting about colour is that no one can claim a sort of privileged relationship with it. Physicists have as much to say about colour as artists, probably more. There's as much interesting commentary on colour in novels and literature as there is and in films as there is in art. Poets have much to say about colour as painters. And when I did this anthology of colour for writing for the Whitechapel, I tried to include as many diverse and divergent commentaries on colour as possible. So there's a great Johnny Cash song called The Man in Black. So it's about colour and clothing. So I included that. And there was that great moment from Pulp Fiction where they're all arguing about, I want to be Mr. Black. No, you can be Mr. Pink. You can be Mr. Brown. And they kind of have this sort of stupid narrative about, I don't want to be Mr. Pink, But it's actually a rather good essay on colour, that short narrative sequence. So that for me is a real pleasure, is that it's open to anyone to join in that way. Okay.
At the beginning, you seemed quite fascinated by how the Brazilian art contemporary scene is socialized rather than the Western.
Yes.
Privatized. But from what I've seen in these slideshows, you seem like your art is mostly being privatized. I just want to know whether you will ever place it in a more social environment.
I show in galleries, it's true, but I also, there's the stuff at the Underground Station in Gloucester Road, Bloomberg. Well, actually, is very private, but I know what you mean. I mean, the Palm House in Edinburgh, and I've done other external works, temporary external works. No, I am interested in it occupying spaces other than just the typical galleries, and in a way, I think the Folkestone, the ballroom in Folkestone was, it was indoors, but it was kind of, in a way, it was not a typical gallery by any means, and it was a very publicly accessible place, I hope. Now, I am interested in how it exists in the world other than through galleries. The great Venezuelan artist Carlos Cruz Diaz, he did his paintings on the sides of nuclear power stations. That's socialized abstract art, not what I'm doing. Or Ligia Pape did a great monochrome piece, which was a 15-meter square white monochrome with 100 people. It was a sheet, and they walked through the streets of Rio in it. It was Guy Brett who proposed that as a kind of socialized monochrome, which I thought was a great motif. So, compared with what's gone on in parts of Latin America, no, I've got a lot of work to do, definitely. I'm doing an outdoor piece, since you asked, in public space in Archway, which opens on the 1st of November. Top of Holloway Road, there's that big archway tower, that very kind of gloomy, dark tower. And Alistair Warman, who runs Byam Shaw College and who used to be the director of the Serpentine Gallery, has long had this plan to invite artists to do things around Archway Tower, to make people look at it again, and to sort of brighten it up a bit, I guess. So I'm doing it's being made at the moment. I'm doing a fountain around in that area, and it's actually it was going to be in the plaza. There's a weird plaza, dead plaza behind the Archway Tower. And I think plazas have fountains, so I'll do a fountain for it. But it's a fountain of lights, coloured lights. So it's 10 meters high, and it's going to be kind of cascade of coloured light in the world, out there. Yeah. All right. All right. Thank you.